Okay, so the mitzvah to send away the mother bird. It's a mitzvah which, at face value, seems to be a very simple mitzvah. I'll read the psukim from the Torah, 2 psukim in yesterday's parasha. Ki yikari kan sipir lefanacha baderech b'chalitza el ha'aretz afreichim ebeitzim v'ha'im revetzis al ha'afreichim oy al ha'beitzim l'sikach im al ha'banim shalech shalech ha'sa'im v'sa'banim tikach loch l'ma'nitav loch v'arach l'yomim. Should a bird's nest chance to be before you on the path, in any tree, on the ground, chicks or eggs, and the mother bird is sitting on the chicks or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother bird together with the young, or according to some opinions it means not take the mother bird while she is on the young. You shall surely send away the mother bird and the young take for yourself, so that it will be good for you and you will merit long life. It seems to be a very simple and straightforward mitzvah. Doesn't seem to be, don't take the whole nest. Just send away the mother. When you hear that mitzvah, what comes to mind? Why would it be a good thing to send away the mother before you take the kids? Mercy? What do you think, David?
So she doesn't see you taking her children.
Okay. Right. You could all spin it different ways, as we'll see, but it seems to be a very straightforward mitzvah. One of the unique things about this mitzvah is that the Torah specifically says that through the fulfillment of this mitzvah, it will be good for you and you will merit long life. Right? It says that, and I believe the only other mitzvah concerning it says those exact words is honoring parents. But it'll be good for you and you merit long life. Most of the mitzvahs in the Torah don't even say any reward in the Torah. And if it does, it definitely doesn't talk about long life. It talks about Hashem will reward you, Hashem will be good to you. But this mitzvah is unique in that the Torah specifically says what the reward is, or specifically gives a reward. Now the Medrash, based on various nuances in the verses, enumerates a number of other rewards that can be brought about as a result of fulfilling this mitzvah. The first is the promise of children. And actually, by the way, I should sort of tell you guys that whatever we managed to cover in today's shir, if anybody is interested in further researching this topic, this Sefer HaChinuch, which we have here, this is from the library in English with the art scroll, mitzvah 544 and 545, has a very elaborate addressing of this mitzvah, more elaborate than the chinuch usually does, and a fascinating discussion. And if you would like to further research it, definitely recommend starting over here. Okay, so I believe the chinuch himself actually brings this idea of meriting to have children because of the words "V'sabonim tikach loch," which literally means that you take the young for yourself. But the Medrash understands it to mean that you'll take the children for yourself. In other words, that you yourself will have children. Another thing the Medrash says is that you will merit to build a new house, because following this, the next pasuk in the Torah talks about building a new house. So you do this mitzvah, you'll merit a new house. Perhaps the most very powerful thing the Medrash says is that it actually causes hastening the coming of Mashiach, because this particular mitzvah talks about sending away the mother bird, and the reward is Hashem sending us Mashiach, sending the ox and the donkey, a reference from the pasuk in Yeshaya talking about Mashiach. And finally, the Medrash also talks about hastening the coming of Elijah the prophet, which is also, of course, connected to Mashiach. Okay, so there's a lot. The Medrash definitely very much extols the virtues of this mitzvah. And because of these Medrashim, hastening Mashiach, merit to have children, many people have, and you may have heard of this before, it's become very popular in many circles today, to look for opportunities to fulfill this mitzvah. And you'll even see advertisements in shuls, not so common in Chicago, but in New York and definitely in Israel. You'll see advertisements. If anybody wants to have the opportunities to do this mitzvah, call this and this number. And there's pictures. You could find pictures of various great rabbis and Jewish leaders going out into fields and etc.
If you call the number, where do you get to go do this?
Well, in all sorts of places. You go to, the people do the research. They find where there are nests, and in any places where there are trees, there are usually nests. It has to be a kosher bird, of course. And there's many opportunities to do this. And, like I said, you often see the photographs of various Jewish community leaders being honored to do so. Specifically, people who are struggling in the Frum community. It's common for people who are struggling. Maybe should bench them all. People who are struggling with fertility. So, based on this medrash, they'll look. One of the segulas that they'll look to do is to do the mitzvah of Shiluach Haken, sending away the mother bird. So, the end of the class, I'll come back to this, but I want to go back a little bit. There is a very curious Mishnah, which is the first reference to there being anything unusual about this mitzvah. Again, so far we've seen very straightforward psukim. We've seen the medrash which extols the virtues of this mitzvah. But there is a very strange Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Brachas, where the Mishnah talks about various things which are inappropriate for somebody to say during his tefillah, during his davening. Now, today we have a fixed text of the Siddur by the Anshe Knesset Agdela, and more or less people don't deviate from that too much, although you can add your own supplications if you want to at the right place during the davening. But definitely once upon a time where there was no text. Somebody who was good at davening, he would get up and he would lead the prayer, and he would be the representative of the community to pray to Hashem. So the Mishnah says over there 3 things which are inappropriate to say. Ha'omer moedim and moedim. We say moedim anach malach, we thank Hashem. If somebody repeats the word moedim twice, then meshatkin, we silence him. If he repeats the word that we thank Hashem, we thank twice, then if he repeats it, we silence him. This is not a valid form of prayer, because that gives off the impression that there are 2 reshuyos, that he's thanking, that there is what's the word, polytheism. So we don't allow for multiple moedims. I forget what the 3rd thing is. Just a second.
I think it's going around with bare feet in the show.
No. That's that.
One.
1 second. It says,
Look,
Al Tov Yizach Shmecha. This Mishnah, other Mishnahs say that, but Al Tov Yizach Shmecha, that we thank Hashem for the good, or we praise Hashem for the good. So then that's also, we silence him, because we have to recognize that everything comes from Hashem, the good and the not so good. Okay? And then the Mishnah says something very strange. If somebody says, Al kan siper yagiu rachmecha, that your mercy extends even to the bird's nest, or in the words of the Mishnah in Megillah, which is just a more elaborate form of the same Mishnah, no, it's exactly the same actually. But basically, if somebody is saying that, look, Hashem, you're so merciful, you have mercy on the bird's nest. So that's a way of, in his prayer, he's talking about how merciful Hashem is. Mishat Kenoise, we silence him. That is not an appropriate prayer, and that it's so inappropriate to the extent that one has to silence someone who says so. And this is a very strange Mishnah. What's wrong with saying Moedim? We understand. We don't want to have polytheism. He's denying the fact that everything comes from God. What is wrong with mentioning the fact that Hashem was merciful over the bird's nest? By the way, we call it Shiluach Haken, but grammatically it's Shiluach Haken. Kain is a nest. Kan means nest of. So in the Torah, where it talks, in the pasuk in the Torah, it says kan because it says kan sipur, the nest of a bird. But if you just use the word in by itself, the grammatically correct way to say it would be Shiluach Haken. Okay. But whatever the case is. Okay, so what are we going to do with, what's this Mishnah trying to teach us? Why is it inappropriate to say, Al kan sipur yagir rachmecha? So, of course, the Gemara itself, both in the Babylonian and in Jerusalem Talmud, discuss this. And interestingly enough, both Talmuds give 2 reasons, which pretty much are the same. the words are slightly different, and maybe you could find, but the gist of it is the same. The first reason the Gemara gives is because he is matal kino b'maisa bereshis, by highlighting the fact that Hashem has mercy on the bird's nest. We could cause jealousy amongst the creations of Hashem, as if to say Hashem has mercy on the bird's nest, but not on other animals, or not on other species, or not on people. The Yerushalmi, in the words of the Yerushalmi, it's as if it's kari tagor. It's as if you're not being accepting to Hashem's ways. If you're praying, Hashem, you had mercy on the bird, have mercy on me, which perhaps is similar to the idea of not recognizing that everything comes from Hashem. So that's the first approach in the Talmud, that there's nothing wrong with the idea of Hashem. Of course, Hashem is being merciful to the bird's nest. That's not the issue. But the issue is that if you invoke this during prayer, there could be some connotation of either being unfair or not accepting or creating some sort of jealousy amongst the various creatures. The second reason in the Talmud is because he's oisem midoisov sha'oisem midoisov shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu rachmim. He is making, he's making the midos. I'll get back to that in a second. He's making the midos of God to be mercy, and the truth is that they are mere decrees. Now, the way Rashi and the Rambam explain this, what that means is midos means mitzvahs. He is looking at Hashem's mitzvos as being mercy. He is saying that the reason why Hashem is telling us to send away the mother bird and not to take it all together is because Hashem is being merciful on the birds. And really, that's not true. The purpose of the mitzvah is not about mercy. The purpose of the mitzvah is a gzeira. It's a chayk. Hashem gives us His commandments so that we should, in the words of Rashi, so to demonstrate that we are His servants, we are subservient to Him, and He gives us His decrees and we obey them, not because we understand them, and this is something which the nations and the Satan mark us for, but we know that our loyalty to God is not based on rationale, it's for all mitzvahs. Right? So that's the second reason of the Gemara.
So
just to summarize, yes?
By separating the mother from the nest and calling it a mitzvah, logically it doesn't make sense.
No, it could make sense, but it doesn't make a difference. We do it because it was
That's what
commanded,
I'm
not
saying.
because it makes sense.
It's because God, right, what you just said. I'm just saying, to me it doesn't make sense. But if it's a hope, then we're obligated because Hashem commanded us to do this. Correct?
Yes. In the words of Rashi, I think, because the Rambam, this is okay. So, like I said, this it is a strange Gemara. Whichever way you look at it, and hopefully by the end of the class we'll have perhaps a clearer way of understanding this. But at face value, it's a very strange law. You're not allowed to invoke God's mercy on the mother bird in prayer, because that would seem to suggest that the mitzvah of sending away the mother bird has something to do with compassion. And the truth is, in the words of the Gemara, it's not compassion, it's a decree. It's not about compassion on the bird, it's about Hashem's decree to us. That is the way Rashi understands this Gemara, and it's also the way the Rambam in his commentary to the Mishnah understands the Gemara. As we'll see soon, the Rambam is one of the most complicated. Hold on, Mark. I promise you that by the end of the class, your questions will be addressed, and if they're not, ask me then. I'm fairly confident of that. Okay. The Rambam, I should mention actually, there's three places where the Rambam talks about this. One is in his Mishnah Torah, in his Book of Laws, where he just paraphrases a Mishnah and the second reason of the Gemara. He says, if somebody says this in prayer, we silence him, and because it's a chayk, it's just a decree, and it's not about mercy. In his commentary to the Mishnah, he says pretty much the same thing, but in his guide to the perplexed, he says something starkly different. Over there, he says that the reason for the mitzvah of sending away the mother bird is because of compassion, and I'll explain soon what type of compassion the Rambam is talking about over there. And he says this, that the Talmud says that it's not because of compassion. That goes according to opinion, who in general doesn't like to attribute reason to the mitzvahs, but that's not our approach. And he gets into this philosophical thing. And many, in Hebrew there's an expression, many pens have been broken. Much ink has been spilt over understanding the true opinion of the Rambam and trying to synthesize between. There is no, to the best of my knowledge, there's no tiny class today.
To the best of your knowledge.
Yes, but maybe text Rabbi Epstein and double check. Where was I? Yeah. So much ink has been spilled to try and synthesize. I'm not going to go into that right now, but it's just if we're mentioning it, it would be remiss of me not to mention that. Okay. So. Very strange Gemara. This mitzvah is not about compassion. It's a chayk. It's a decree, and it's so. We're so adamant about it not being about compassion to the extent that if somebody does think that it has to do with compassion, we must silence him. It's not just they're wrong. This is like a serious mistake. Now, to make things even more confusing, if we look in the Rishonim. We will see that many of them do indeed understand this mitzvah, to be about compassion. And in a number of different ways. Actually, even before the Rishonim, we have two references in the Medrash. Medrash is considered which Medrash is this? Medrash? Yeah, I mean this is Tanaic usually. So. Over there's two references in the Medrash to just as the Holy One extended his compassion over animals, so too he was filled with compassion for birds. In the animals here means like mammals. How do we know this? As it says, if you happen upon a bird's nest along the road, etc. So that's the Medrash Rabbah Dvarim, which explicitly talks about this mitzvah being to do connected with compassion. A righteous man knows the needs of his animals, says the pasuk in Proverbs. A righteous man, says the Medrash, is the Holy One, for it is written in the Torah, do not take the mother together with her young. So the righteous man, meaning the Holy One, has compassion on the bird. Now, in the Rishonim, moving on to the Rishonim, it is very clear that the medieval Jewish thinkers, many of them, understand this to be a mitzvah of compassion. One approach of the Rashbam is a grandson of Rashi, and his approach is that it's just heartless to take both the mother and the young. So at least, leave one of them at least. The Chassam Sofer, actually much later on, of course, Chassam Sofer, he adds that taking the mother and the young is only possible because the mother stays to protect her young. So taking advantage of her maternal instincts is especially heartless, right? So it's sort of the mother is there to protect the young, and you're sort of turning it against her. That's especially cruel. Additionally, that many Rishonim, the Sefer Chinuch actually also brings this, that conceptually at least, taking both the mother and the bird is sort of having disregard for the species as a whole, that we don't care about the continuation, the perpetuation of this species. And the Rambam himself, like I mentioned before in the guide, also connects it to compassion. And basically what he says is that often the young are not even they're not really good to eat, and therefore if you send away the mother bird and all you're left with is the young, you will more likely than not just end up leaving the whole nest alone. So by the Torah commanding you to be compassionate towards the mother, not only will you not end up in other words, not only will you not be cruel enough to take the mother and the bird and the young, but chances are you will leave the whole nest alone. So it's clear. So let's talk about being compassionate. What's the compassion over here? One thing is that we're not letting the mother see the mother go through. The Rambam talks about this. We don't make the mother go through the pain of watching her young being taken away. And I think the Rambam explains over there that even when the mother comes back and sees the nest empty, that's not as painful to her as actually seeing the birds taken away. But better yet would be not to take anything. Right? The Torah allows us to. The Torah allows us to take it because, like the Torah allows us to shecht. In fact, the Rambam on that Mishnah, where the Gemara says that it's not rachamim, it's not mercy, it's just a chok, it's just a decree. The Rambam says because were it to be mercy, the Torah wouldn't have allowed us to shecht. How could you shecht an animal? How could you kill the animal? So clearly, it's not about mercy for animals. We're not so worried about mercy for animals. So it's just a decree. That's what the Rambam says over there. But coming back to the commentary here, to the guide, over here we're saying that strictly speaking, you're allowed to take the young because we allow you to eat meat. Yeah. The bottom line is the Torah allows us to eat meat, but it's definitely a cruel thing to do to the mother, and therefore we make you send away the mother bird with the hope that you may end up leaving the nest alone entirely.
But then you don't fulfill the decree.
So you don't fulfill the mitzvah. No. So
The mitzvah, yeah.
right. So I'm going to get to that. How does this fit with the Gemara? But the way we see here that the Medrash and many of the Rishonim and the Rambam himself in the guide, they say very clearly that this is nothing to that this is about compassion. It's about us being compassionate on the birds, and that the ideal situation would be to leave the whole nest alone. By the way, this is also alluded to by the Alshich. The Alshich is much later on. The Alshich is, but also considered very prominent commentary on the Torah. He was, So he also. It's clear from him that it would be better to leave the nest alone entirely. Now, one thing that I find very strange in this whole discussion, which I have not yet found a good answer for, is why do none of these invoke? Why we don't see many people in the discussion? We don't see people referring to the first reason of the Gemara. The first reason of the Gemara was because you're creating jealousy amongst Ma'aseh Bereishis. Now, in other words, you're creating jealousy that Hashem is merciful on the bird, but not on other things, right? Now, according to that reason, it is about being merciful, compassionate to the bird. So everyone's busy, like, okay, how does this fit with the Gemara? Why doesn't for example, the Rambam? Why in the Rambam in his book of laws in the Mishnah Torah, he says that the reason why you're not allowed, that somebody says Al Kan Sipper, we silence him because it's not about compassion, it's about a decree. And now we have this problem that the Rambam in the guide and the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, and we have to deal with that. Why couldn't the Rambam have just adopted the first reason of the Talmud, and then it wouldn't be a problem? I don't have a satisfactory answer to that question, but it does remain somewhat of an enigma here. How do all these Rishonim who talk about this mitzvah being about compassion, how do they deal with the Gemara? Now, just they could hold like the first reading of the Gemara. That's one approach. The second approach is that actually, what we mean to say, what the Gemara means to say when it says that Hashem's mitzvahs are mercy and a decree and not about compassion, what we mean to say is that you can't say anything definitive. We can never fully grasp the extent of the reason of the mitzvah. And therefore, for a person to come and say in his tefillah, in his prayer, as a definitive statement, that the reason for this mitzvah is because of compassion, that is inappropriate, and then we silence him. But of course, if a person wants to drash and wants to think about the mitzvah and wants to take away something and comes away with compassion, there's nothing inappropriate with that. It's just you have to know that whatever you understand, we can never understand the full extent of Hashem's mitzvahs and Hashem's reasons. So it's a partial thing, and it's perfectly fine in the context of discussion and learning Torah. It's just not fine in the context of prayer. So perhaps those Rishonim who do talk of it as being about compassion, will understand it in that way.
So you're saying it's not that it's not about compassion, it's just that if you were going to mention it in prayer as being about compassion, it would be inappropriate to use it that way in that context.
Yeah, because somehow being in prayer is about it being is more definitive. You can't say a definitive statement that this is, and sort of say that the reason for this mitzvah is this. How do you know it's this? Maybe it's this and something else. Maybe, right? The Sefer Chinuch himself writes elsewhere that even those mitzvahs which are perfectly reasonable, like thou shalt not murder, right? We can't understand the full reason of the mitzvah, because there will be a scenario where you think it makes perfect sense to murder, and yet the Torah does not allow it, right? So we can understand parts of the mitzvah. I mean, Chassidus talks about this a lot, about the difference between chukim and mishpatim, that even those mitzvahs which we do understand, we have to be able to do as a decree disregarding our own appreciation of it, and even those mitzvahs we don't understand, we have to be able to do with the same vigor and enthusiasm that we do those mitzvahs which we do understand.
I thought you were saying that if you're going to invoke the mentioning of the bird as a form of God's compassion, then you're like neglecting God's compassion in other ways or whatever other way that you explained.
That was the
before.
first reason of the Gemara.
Right.
There's two reasons in the Gemara. The first reason is matal kina b'maisa bereishis,
Right.
which basically means that you're sort of you're focusing attention on something which could cause jealousy, right? The lions might say, "Hey, that's not fair."
Right.
And the other reason is because it's Rashi, that he's treating Hashem's mitzvahs as being because of compassion, and the truth is that they are just mere decrees.
Oh.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
I have to go.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'll catch up with you later.
Yeah, you can ask me later. I'll be later. Yeah. Okay. Okay. What about the Ramban? Did I mention the Ramban yet? Okay. One of the ways of understanding the concept of jealousy is that it goes into the whole question of hashkacha pratis. So the Baal Shem Tov taught that everything in the world has exact divine providence. But some of the Rishonim believe that only human beings have divine providence over the individual, and an animal life has divine providence over the species. So the Meiri says that actually birds are an exception to that, and birds, there is divine providence over the individual bird, and therefore the jealousy would be that it's not fair. Why does the bird get individual attention from God? Anyway, okay. So let's just summarize. The Mishnah and the Gemara have this somewhat difficult law to understand about not mentioning God's mercy on the birds in prayer. The Gemara gives two reasons. And we've seen that many Rishonim, despite the Gemara, many Rishonim do understand this mitzvah to be connected with compassion on the bird. And they even explicitly say that it would be better to leave the nest alone entirely. How do these Rishonim deal with the Gemara? So either they hold like the first reason in the Gemara, that it's about jealousy, it's not about the choik, that it's not the second reason, which, again, I mean, there's a difficulty with that, because the Rishonim have to be able to make sense of both answers in the Gemara, really. Right? Or the second possible way of dealing with that is that the Gemara is not ruling out categorically that it has anything to do with compassion. The Gemara is just saying that you can't make a definitive statement about it in prayer. And a third approach is as follows. The Ramban, he has a good translation of it over here. The Ramban, and it's interesting because, as we'll see soon, a lot of this some of this discussion is going to boil down to whether you approach this mitzvah from a rationalist approach or from a mystical approach. And it's interesting to me that this comes from the Ramban, from Nachmanides, because he was a Mekubal also. Much of his commentary is Kabbalah. And in his commentary to Parshas Kiseitze, he says that as follows. I'll just read you from this translation. Similarly, I'll read the whole thing. These agadot, these pieces of Gemara, which present some difficulties to Maimonides, in my view have a different meaning. They mean to say that there is no benefit in the mitzvah to the Holy One himself, but rather the benefit is for man, to prevent him from being harmed or from a false belief or a deplorable attribute. Similarly,
What?
attribute. Okay, here's the important part. Similarly, that which they have said, quote, because he is making the attributes of the Holy One into mercy, whereas they are nothing other than decrees, right, referencing this Talmud, means to say that God did not have compassion on the nest of birds, and his mercy did not extend to the animal and its young. For his compassion does not extend to animals to prevent us from filling our needs with them, for if so, he would have prohibited their slaughter. Rather, the reason for the prohibition is to teach us the trait of compassion. The Eibishter doesn't have compassion. Of course, there is v'rachmav al kol ma'asav. Hashem has mercy upon all of his creations, but there is no specific mercy on animals when it comes to us using them for our needs, for our consumption. V'haraya, you're allowed to shecht, you're allowed to slaughter animals. But there are, and I believe he's also talking about the prohibition against slaughtering the mother and the young on the same day. Yeah, the mother, not birds. You're not allowed to slaughter a mother, a sheep, an animal. You're not allowed to sleep the mother and the child on the same day. Not because Hashem has mercy on those animals, but because we're supposed to be merciful on those. Not on those animals. We are supposed to imbibe the trait of mercy, and therefore, when the Mishnah says that somebody who talks about God's mercy extending, God's compassion extending to the bird's nest, the reason why we silence him is because he's missing the point. It's not about God's mercy on the bird's nest. It's about imbibing the character trait of mercy within ourselves. It's a very nice pshat. It doesn't fit. It fits smoothly with the Mishnah. It doesn't fit so smoothly with the Gemara, because the Gemara says that the mitzvahs of Hashem are not mercy, they are decrees, right? So they are decrees. So according to this Ramban, if you would like to try and synthesize between this Ramban and the Gemara, what you're going to have to say is that not that it's a decree with no discernible meaning, but that it's a decree to, rather than it being an expression of Hashem's compassion on the bird, it's a decree to us to learn about compassion. It could go, but it doesn't fit like a glove. It doesn't fit so neatly. I should also mention, before I move on, that the Sefer HaChinuch has an entire different reading of the Gemara, because until now, if you remember, the first time I read the Gemara, I said the word midosov, Rashi translates the word midosov as being mitzvahs. That Hashem's mitzvahs are a decree, not mercy. But the Sefer HaChinuch says no, the word midosov, doesn't say it in so many words, but this is what he means to say. That the word midosov does not mean mitzvahs, the word midosov means Hashem's attributes. And what the Gemara means to say is that Hashem's attributes are not chas v'shalom like human attributes, which we are born with certain instincts that we can do nothing about. All of Hashem's attributes are because Chochmasa Yisparich dictates, Hashem wisdom dictates that is the way He wants to behave. I'll just read for you some key words over here. The trait of compassion that we attribute to Hashem is not, heaven forbid, the same as the trait of compassion that people have. For in people, the trait of compassion is instinctive in their nature, as imparted to them by the Creator, blessed be He. They are therefore compelled to act out of compassion when faced with a situation that evokes their sympathy. Hashem's compassion, on the other hand, draws from His transcendent will, a will that is not influenced by any emotion, compulsion, or impulse. That is to say that His wisdom dictated that it is proper to act merciful because it is a good trait. And all good things emanate from Hashem, so does the good trait of compassion. However, Hashem does not do things or command us to do things out of compassion as though He is compelled by a sense of sympathy or pity. Rather, He acts with compassion and commands us to act with compassion when, in His infinite wisdom, He determines that compassion is warranted. Okay? So, in the Chinuch's approach to this Gemara, the Gemara is not in any way saying that the mitzvah of Shiluach Haken is not about compassion. Of course it's about being compassionate on the bird. But we are being compassionate on the bird not because Chas v'Shalom Hashem couldn't help himself and Hashem felt so bad for the bird and he was sort of by instinct had to be merciful. No, Hashem in his great wisdom, his infinite wisdom, saw it fit to tell us to be compassionate in this particular case, and therefore we have to be compassionate about it. So it's not about whether or not the mitzvah is about compassion, but the reason why it's so terrible to talk about Al Kan Tzibur Yagia Rachmecha, to invoke Hashem's compassion on the bird in prayer, is because somehow, and I can't say I understand this so clearly, but somehow that would seem to indicate that you believe that Hashem is sort of confined in a certain way of behavior, or in a certain way of instruction. Okay. Anyway, like I said to you before, the Chinuch does elaborate unusually longer than he usually does, and going through various possible reasons for this mitzvah. But that is his approach to the Gemara. So whilst his approach definitely fits well with the words of the Gemara, it does come back to the question of why is it so. Like, okay, I get it, but why is it really that terrible to say so in prayer? Just because it can be misconstrued to mean. I mean, it doesn't seem to be as avert of an offense as saying moedim moedim, right? Are you raising your hand or are you stretching? Okay. Okay, we have to move on. So that's sort of the synopsis of the Shittas and the Rishonim. Now, there actually is a very maybe strange approach to this mitzvah, which seems to smack in the face of everything we've said until now. So in case you thought the surprises were finished, and that is the approach of the Zohar to this mitzvah. And the Zohar says that actually, and the Zohar, I think the Zohar fits the best with the Gemara. In other words, in terms of fitting the best with the Mishnah and the Gemara and the words and everything, is the Zohar. But conceptually, it's somewhat of a difficult thing to understand. The Zohar says that actually the reason for the mitzvah of sending away the mother bird is nothing to do with compassion at all. It's everything to do with cruelty. It's about being cruel to the mother bird by sending her away and stealing her nest. And the reason is because what happens is when the angel, everything down in this world has a representing angel in the supernal worlds, and when the angel, when the mother departs weeping, her children are crying. Just read the translation from here. He agonizes for his birds and asks Hashem, does it not say his compassion is on all of his works? We say that in Ashrei, yeah? Why did you decree the mother to be exiled from her nest? What does Hashem do? He gathers all of his other angels and says to them that this angel is concerned for the welfare of a bird and is complaining of its suffering. Is there none amongst you who will seek merit on my children Israel and for the Shekhinah which is in exile? So to speak, by imposing exile and inflicting suffering on the mother and the young of on the mother bird and the young of the nest, we are reminding Hashem, so to speak, of the suffering of the mother and the young in the sense of Hashem and the Jewish people, and perhaps in line with the medrash that we started off the shir with, that this hastens the coming of Mashiach, because Hashem remembers about the Jews being in exile and the Shekhinah being in exile. So it's a bit of a difficult Zohar to understand, because usually we're taught about being compassionate to animals. I mean, there's V'rachma v'kol ma'asav, yeah, that's the pasuk in Ashrei, and the mitzvahs of Tzar Ba'alei Chaim, of making sure we're not cruel to animals, etc. And but nevertheless, the Zohar does fit very well with the Gemara. It's not a good thing to say in prayer about Hashem's mercy extending to the mother bird, because actually that is the opposite of the intent of the mitzvah. And it fits well with the second reason of the Gemara, that you're making Hashem's mitzvahs, you're treating Hashem's mitzvahs as compassion, but really they are just a decree, because it's not about compassion, it's about the opposite of compassion. Now, There is another discussion in the halachic, in the paskim, which doesn't necessarily link with the Zohar, but many paskim do link it with the Zohar. And the question is as follows: if I happen to chance upon a nest, and there's a mother bird sitting with the young on the eggs, and I have no interest in, I have no interest. Baruch Hashem, I have a good meal. I don't need the eggs. I don't need the young. I don't need the mother. I just want to leave it alone and go on my way. Do I have a mitzvah? Am I obligated to send away the mother bird to fulfill the mitzvah of Shiluach Haken? Or can I just go on my way? And the mitzvah of sending away the mother is only if I do want to take the young. Now, most poskim understand that the mitzvah is only if you want the mother bird, or if you want the young. If you want to eat the young, whether it's the chicks or the eggs, then you're obligated to send away the mother bird. But if you don't want them, then just leave it. And in fact, this was explicit in the Rambam and in the Ralbag and the Al-Sheikh and the other and at least in those three sources which we mentioned earlier, that actually part of the intent of the mitzvah is to instill the compassion within you, and that we hope that you'll even be even more compassionate and leave the nest alone. Of course, just like we allow you to shecht, we allow you to send away the mother bird and take the young, but we would prefer that you just leave the whole thing alone. So clearly, those Rishonim held that it is perfectly permissible to leave. There's no mitzvah to go and
Disturb the nest.
disturb the nest.
So, but if you do it just to fulfill the mitzvah, so you've been cool.
Hold on. We'll get So according to to that way of understanding, it will be completely senseless to say I'm doing it just to do the mitzvah. The whole mitzvah is to be merciful, to be compassionate. So you're going to send away the mother. It doesn't make any sense to do it just to do the mitzvah. If you want to eat the young, then that's the way to do it. That is one approach. That is one approach. The Chassam Sofer says explicitly that to send away the mother bird when you have no do for it goes against the grain of the whole mitzvah. Okay. However, there are those opinions who hold that actually no, that if you see the mother bird, if you see the nest, then you are obligated to send away the mother bird. The Torah says when you chance upon a nest, you have to send away. You shouldn't take the mother and the thing and the young. You should send away the mother. So if you don't chance upon the nest, you don't chance upon it. But if you chance upon it, then you're obligated, even if you have no interest whatsoever, you're obligated to send away the mother bird. Now there is another discussion that this question could be asked according to both opinions, but let's just mention it now. According to the opinion that you are obligated to send away the mother bird, are you then obligated to take the children also, or could you just leave it? Could you just send away the mother bird and walk away? Or v'ashabonim tikach loch, and the young you should take for you. So even if I don't want the eggs, but in order to fulfill the mitzvah, if I chance upon it, I must send away the mother and I must take the eggs. There's discussion again, but there's no time to get into that right now. But again, this opinion holds. The most famous proponent of this opinion is the Shuvas Chavos Yoy, Rabbi Yochaim Bachrach, who was 17th century, maybe. It says here, Rabbi Yochaim Bachrach, 1638 to 1702. Yeah, he was, I believe, he was before the Chassam Sofer. Okay. Anyway, so now, according to that approach would seem to fit very well with the Zohar, because, like the Zohar says, the whole idea of sending away the mother bird is to be cruel to the mother bird so that she will cry, and that will invoke Hashem's mercy upon us. Right? So, the Rabbi Yochaim Bachrach shita would seem to fit very well with the Zohar. But it may not fit so well, like the Chassam Sofer says, with the opinions of the Rishonim that hold that it's about being compassionate. I should also mention that there's another reason why. Well, you know what? I'll get to that result, but let's get there in a minute. Now, there is another Gemara which is very important to bring up over here, and that is the Gemara in Chulin. The Gemara in Chulin talks about the pasuk. Yeah. the Gemara says like this. You may have thought that you should travel to the mountains and hills in order to find a nest. Therefore, the Torah tells us when you happen across it, only when it happens to you. Right? Now, at face value, this Gemara would seem to be the biggest proof to the opinion that you are obligated to send away the mother bird, even if you have no interest in it. Because if you're not obligated to send, in other words, if you adopt the approach that if you see a nest, you must send away the mother bird, so then the question makes sense that maybe I have to make sure I find a nest, just like you have to put on tefillin. Right? Now, if you have tefillin on the table, you must put them on. What if you don't have tefillin on the table? Well, you better make sure you go and find your tefillin because you have to put them on. So the Gemara thought that the same thing applies to the nest. If you see a nest, you have to send away the mother bird. What if you don't see a nest? Well, go out to the hills and the forest and find the nest. Therefore, the Torah says, no, if you happen upon it, you don't have to. It's not like tefillin that you must make sure you have tefillin. This is different only if you happen to chance upon it. Right? So that would seem to fit very well with the shit of the Chavis Yor, that you're obligated to do it, and that would fit with, arguably that could fit very well with the Zohar. But if you say that you only do it if you want it, so then why would you have thought you have to go out to the... he actually puts it very nicely. He says... If one takes the approach that the mitzvah is optional, it would seem to require reading the passage in the following rather awkward way. I might have thought that one should travel to the mountains and hills in order to find the nest, and choose to fulfill the mitzvah if one wants the chicks. And therefore, the Torah tells us only when you happen across it that one is only asked to fulfill the mitzvah when one happens across it and wants the chicks, and one is not required to look for opportunities to fulfill the mitzvah. In other words, if you're only obligated to do the mitzvah if you happen to want the chicks, then why would you have thought that maybe you have to go out to the hills and the mountains to look for a nest? Right? So that is, I believe, the Chavis Yor himself. The Chavis Yor himself uses this Gemara as proof to his opinion that it's obligatory. However, there is actually, just with a little bit of creative thinking, there is a very simple way. In fact, I see everyone talks about the creative thinking, but actually, personally, when I saw the Gemara, this is how I understood it. I see the Chavis Yor uses the proof. I understood the Gemara the first time I saw the Gemara. This is how I understood it. To precisely be negating the approach of the Chavis Yor. I might have thought that this mitzvah is obligatory, and that therefore you have to go out to the mountains and the fields and look for a nest. Therefore, the Torah says when you chance upon it, that it's not obligatory, and that you only have to do it when you want the chicks or the eggs. Right? So, yes, when the Gemara says that, I would have thought that you have to go out to the forest, the mountains, and the fields. The Gemara is entertaining the notion that perhaps it's obligatory. But then when the Gemara says that actually no, the Torah specifically says only when you chance upon it, so that's what the Gemara is saying, that it's only voluntary, and therefore even when I happen to chance upon it, I only have to do the mitzvah if I want the young. If I don't have any interest in taking the young, then there's no mitzvah to do it. And Adarabba, perhaps it's even preferable to leave the nest alone. By the way, the Gemara, which talks, I mentioned to you earlier that this is one of the few mitzvahs which the Torah specifically talks about reward in this world, about having long life. So the Gemara says over there that if this small mitzvah, which is ke'isa, which is such a cheap mitzvah to fulfill, then the Torah rewards you. So then, how much more so will we be rewarded for the mitzvahs which are more difficult to fulfill? Now again, the fact that the Gemara infers that this mitzvah does have a small price seems to indicate that you wanted the birds, and that would be the small price. If you weren't interested in it, then it's free. That's not Isser, it doesn't have a cheap price, it's completely free. I didn't have anything to lose. The Chavis Yor, on the other hand, says that the Gemara Kushul Isser teaches us that when you chance upon a nest, you're obligated to do it, even if it's going to cost you money to do so. Right? I have to go and buy a ladder or whatever, it doesn't matter. I have to go and I have to do it. Now, let's go back to where we started from. So we mentioned at the beginning of the shir that the Medrash talks about very tremendous rewards for this mitzvah, and that it has become practice in many circles that people actually look for the opportunity to do this mitzvah. Now, this is a step further than the Chavos Yair, because the Chavos Yair is saying that if you happen to chance upon a nest, then you're obligated to send away the mother. But even the Chavos Yair does not say that you have to go, like the Gemara says, you might have thought you have to go out to the mountains and to the fields and do so and look for a nest. So the Torah says, well, you chance upon it. Nobody is saying, even the Chavos Yair wasn't saying that you have to go out, like you asked, where are you going to do it? Yeah, nobody says you have to go out to the forest and look for a nest to be able to do it with. But, so what would be the argument in favor of doing that? So that is as follows. First of all, so there's a number of sources for that. So first of all, the Ben Ish Chai, there's a very strange tshuva. There's a tshuva sefer called Torah Lishma, which was written by Rabbi, it was written on the pen name of Yechezkel. What did he sign it as? Yechezkel, do you remember? Anyway, but it was written on the pen name, but it was actually written by the Ben Ish Chai, Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, and he says, he writes like this: mitzvah of Shiluach Haken is so precious to the extent that the Medrash says that it will cause Mashiach to come. So why don't we see pious people looking for nests in order to be able to do this mitzvah? So whilst he acknowledges that he doesn't see people doing so, but he is bothered by the fact that he hasn't seen people doing so. And perhaps what would seem to be the strongest source to actually go and go out there and look for nests would seem to be the Arizal, because the Arizal says that every person is obligated to fulfill all the 613 mitzvahs. And he differentiates between three types of mitzvahs. He says there are mitzvahs which you don't have the choice to do. In other words, they don't. For example, nowadays he says you can't bring karbanos because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. Or the mitzvah of yibum or chalitza. He actually includes in that category the mitzvah of giving a get. Nobody's going to say, "Oh, there's some virtue in fulfilling all the mitzvahs, so I should divorce my wife in order to fulfill that mitzvah." Or like somebody said, "I divorced her and I remarried her in order to fulfill the mitzvah of machzir grushasei, to remarry a divorcee." Right? Or if you don't have a firstborn son, then you can't do the mitzvah of pidyon haben. Right? That is one category of mitzvah, and that mitzvah that Arizal says those mitzvahs, there's no question, for example, that if you're presented, right, somebody is granted the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of pidyon haben by having a firstborn son, so then it's a tremendous chus that you get to fulfill this mitzvah of pidyon haben. Personally, I was not zeicher to fulfill that mitzvah because my wife is a Bas Levi, yeah? So, so the Arizal says your neshama is not missing its perfection by missing out on that mitzvah because you weren't presented with the opportunity to fulfill. Those mitzvahs are things which you're not presented the opportunity to fulfill. Whilst, like I'm saying, there is definitely a certain excitement and a privilege to be able to do those mitzvahs as well. But all other mitzvahs, you are obligated to make sure you do during your lifetime, and if you don't, then that could cause your neshama to have to be born again into another lifetime to be able to fulfill whatever it missed. And then he says that there are, that's sort of the both extremes, but then he says there are mitzvahs in the middle, and he gives the example of Shiluach Haken, that even though you're not obligated to literally to chase after it, rather it's kiyakare, that only if you happen to chance upon it, nevertheless, it is good for a person to look for opportunities to do them in order to complete the tikkun of being able to fulfill all the mitzvahs. So just to summarize where we're up to, the most extreme view we had was the Chavos Yair, who says that the most extreme halachic view we had was the Chavos Yair, who says that if you happen to chance upon a nest, you're obligated to send away the mother bird. But what would seem to be the implication from the Arizal is that even if you don't chance upon it, it's a good idea, you're not obligated, but it's a good idea to go out there and look for a nest to send it away. And again, of course, this would be completely counterintuitive to those opinions who hold that the mitzvah is about compassion, to actually go out there and you have no interest in the mother or in, just to be able to fulfill the mitzvah, which, according to the Arizal, seems to have this quality of being able to fill your tikkun of your neshama to do all the mitzvahs, and it goes against the whole grain of everything that we stand for, according to other opinions. So that's a bit of a thing. What I want to finish off with is as follows. Somebody once invited the Rebbe to fulfill the mitzvah of Shiluach Haken, or Shiluach Haken. And the Rebbe responded to him b'zeh haloshin, in these words: Kavanasi ritzuya, your intentions are well-meaning. In other words, I appreciate it. Aval me'olam no shamati sheychapsu zeh. I have never seen, somewhat paraphrasing, I mean not paraphrasing, but somewhat along the lines of the Ben Ish Chai, I have never seen people look for the opportunity to do this mitzvah. There is a principle in halacha that just because you haven't seen something, that doesn't, in other words, lack of evidence is not evidence of absence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That is a principle in halacha. But there are exceptions to the rule. And in other words, if in a scenario, in a case where were there to be were the phenomenon to exist, one would expect to have evidence. So in such a case, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. So in other words, the Rebbe is saying this is not some obscure thing like chalitza, which this is something which, if people were looking to fulfill this mitzvah, then we would have heard about it. And the fact that we've never heard example from our Gedolei Hadoros over the generations to look for this mitzvah, this is evidence of absence. In other words, this is evidence that it is not appropriate to look for opportunity to fulfill this mitzvah. Al derech hatzachos, the Rebbe finished off in a somewhat humorous way. I will infer Mimayim Razal Prat L'Mazuman. The Gemara says Ki Yikari Prat L'Mazuman, that when you chance upon a nest, and not a nest which is prepared. So based on this, if you have a nest in your own property, then there's no mitzvah to send away the mother bird. It's only if it's found baderech, on the way, somewhere in the forest, in the field, in the mountains, on the street. But if it's in your own house, there's no mitzvah of Shiluach Haken, right? If you have a bird nesting, sometimes you find underneath your gutter there's a bird's nest. To the best of my knowledge, according to all opinions, there's no mitzvah of Shiluach Haken in that case. So the Gemara says prat mezuman if something is prepared, but the word mezuman also means invited. So the Rabbi says, in a humorous way, I will say that prat mezuman, that you don't accept an invitation to do Shiluach Haken. So what's the so on the one hand, on the one hand, notwithstanding the Arizal and the Rebbe, usually in Chassidus we very much accept the authority of the Kabbalah Arizal, but notwithstanding the Arizal, the Rebbe refrained from looking for an opportunity to do the mitzvah to the extent that he declined an invitation. So it wasn't like he had to look for the nest was already found and somebody invited him to do the mitzvah and he declined the invitation. Perhaps one could somewhat suggest that I don't have this fully worked out, but the Rebbe was very often emphasized that Kabbalah and Nigla, the mystical aspect of the Torah and the revealed aspects of the Torah, are two halves of one whole. They're body and soul of the same Torah. They're not to be, God forbid, divided into two different entities which we have to sort of synthesize. They are essentially one and the same, and they all fit together neatly like a glove. And very often the Rebbe would address apparent contradictions where it seems to be that the revealed element of Torah and the mystical don't seem to fit, and they're able to explain how actually, if you look deeper, you'll see how they very much do complement each other. And perhaps in line with that sort of reasoning, the Rebbe would say that the Zohar, for example, says that when you fulfill the mitzvah of Shiluach Haken, this causes the angel to cry, and that the cruelty, and that evokes the mercy of Hashem and on the Yidden being in Golus. That is, if Hashem, in other words, if you were in a situation where you were obligated to do the mitzvah, and you did the mitzvah, then that is what causes this ripple effect in the supernal worlds to happen. But just like, if I may borrow, it's not 100% accurate with our reason, but just like we said before, that even though there's some virtue to fulfilling all the mitzvahs, and that somebody who has a firstborn son will be happy at the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of Pidyon Ben, nobody is going to say that when it comes to a get, right? So if somebody goes through the unfortunate situation of having to give a get, so then besides all the heartache he has, maybe there's some sort of added benefit over here that he's had the opportunity to fulfill a mitzvah. But, right, so perhaps we could say have a similar approach to the mitzvah of Shiluach Haken. That no, we don't go and look for nests, and we don't go and look to invoke pain on the mother bird. But if b'hashgacha pratis you chanced upon a nest and you were in a situation where you were obligated to do the mitzvah, or where you were faced with, depending if you take the Chavis Yoyer or the other approach, but you were presented with an opportunity to do the mitzvah, and you happened to, and Hashem directed you, Hashem directed you to that situation to be able to do that mitzvah, so then you were also zeicha to invoke Hashem's mercy based on the pain of the mother. You were also zeicha to invoke Hashem's mercy on the Yidden being in Galus, and as a result of that, to hasten the arrival of Mashiach and Eliyahu Navi, like we started from the Medrash. But this does not therefore mean that you should go and look for opportunities to do that, because whilst there may be a value in doing that mitzvah, like there may be a value in giving the mitzvah a get, there is also a lot of, what's the opposite of value? Damage or whatever it is aggravation in the fulfillment of this mitzvah, and therefore we do not look for opportunities to do it. So whilst it has become the practice in many congregations as a segula to look for opportunities to do this mitzvah, halachically it is it is questionable whether this is a good thing, a practice, and the Chabad ruling in line with the teachings of the Rebbe is that we do not look for opportunities to do this mitzvah, and and like I said, there's much more to be discussed. It's a fascinating discussion, and it's, again, a mitzvah which at face value seems to be such a straightforward mitzvah, but then if you look deeper into it, you find the Gemara and the Mishnah which says that we silence somebody who invokes this in prayer, and from there it only gets more complicated, and fascinating discussion. And if anybody has more time, I can give you the sources. You can start from here, from the Sefer HaChinuch, and there's much more to be said, but our time is up. Shkoyach, thank you all for participating. Yes?
I joined late, but I have a question. Maybe you covered this. Could I go to a farm and chase, like a chicken farm, chase the chicken off the nest